we're leading ourselves through an entire process meant to orientate ourselves plus deal with all of the resistance and things that come up between understanding where we are and getting to where we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what these sessions are about. They're
Okay.
not about, thinking we can wordsmith this one sentence and then now it in itself is going to either get us off the hook or get us on the hook or whatever, right? It's broader. And
Yes.
in November, there will be this vote again as an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to dismantling racism and other forms of oppression and exclusion.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think the experience that people have been having leading up until now has been that there's a need. And then this surprise vote happened that was voided. And that included, I think, like it had to do specifically with the eighth principle. But you and I have noticed in our work, and I've had my own personal experiences, that this applies across the board to just being able to show up as you are in general. And that has especially to do with the practice of decolonizing, is really making space for who we really are and being able to see one another for who they truly are with love and kindness, and to notice in ourselves, we're like, oh man, that's different in a way that stuff is coming up.
Yep.
And it's been other people's experiences, mine included, that when other people have felt discomfort around us for whatever reason, we're the ones that end up feeling the brunt of that, whatever reaction is. And that's that place where we're trying to show people, like, that's where relationships are breaking. So our decolonizing is about learning to be in relationship with one another as we truly are, and to be okay with the discomfort, but to not make it the other person's responsibility to hold that for them in any way. Am I saying, I feel like that makes
total sense to me, right? And I do think that that's the thing that we continually see missing.
Yes.
Is when people forget that we're talking about relationship between people.
Yes.
Yeah, we're not talking about an intellectual exercise or an analysis of research of whether it proves or disproves or something. If one person says, hey, I'm a person of color and I don't feel included here, or I'm a person with this particular characteristic, fill in whatever you want, right? And I want to be included with you, and I want to be a part of this community because there's so many things I value about it, but there's some aspects that make it so that to participate, I have to fundamentally erase a part of me or not allow that part of me to show up. And I want to show up all of me in our space. Yeah. This is the part where some people are really getting that.
Yeah.
That we're talking about people and inclusion and community. And then for some reason, and this is what we're trying to explore during these forums, is that some of us or some parts of us, I think that that's a good way to start to think about things, is that we have parts of ourselves that can be totally on board with something, and then parts of us that are kind of, and other parts that are like, no. And trying to understand where that resistance comes from.
Right.
What fear is it rooted in? So, in this case, if we were to dismantle racism, then what? Is there some fundamental loss? Is there something that we feel we no longer get to partake in because we've done this thing and now changed our beloved community so much that we no longer feel we're a part of it, or what? What exactly is in the way?
Right. And part of these forums, I think, is in also reflecting back to people that our community is completely based on responsiveness to people saying, and we need more of you to show up in a different way for us to be living into our values. And our principles have changed over the years. As as a direct example of what it means for us to be a responsive community, faith community, in relationship to one another, and we've had many changes of policy so that we can stay current and learn as we grow. And this just happens to be that thing of our time. I think, especially while everyone's learning about the true history, shared history with our Indigenous neighbors and siblings, right now, mending these relationships is key. It's the key. So how do we do that? And what's scary for us while we do it. Yeah.
And recognizing then those things that are unconscious within ourselves that are creating environments that, even though we think that they are potentially, the best thing since sliced bread, being Unitarian and doing it this way or that way, just, fills my boots. So therefore it can fill everybody's in this particular way. And it can be really hard for us to imagine that some people may not find, some aspects of how we, not necessarily what we do, right? So sing this song this way, or say this, these words this particular way, not necessarily just that stuff, but the nature, the way in which we engage. And one thing that's come up, I know we've talked about this for sure, is, should the wording be the way it is?
Yeah.
Or should we make it in such a way that it's a little bit more, a little more ambiguous, a little bit more like, hey, we should just be more inclusive. We should be dismantle barriers, but not name those things.
Yeah.
Right? Just leave it as a little bit of a mystery as to what barriers we're talking about. And when you're talking about relationship, this idea that people in our midst, people of color, have said, we want barriers around our inclusion to be dismantled, and naming that, right? And then all of what's going on with Black Lives Matter outside of our communities being reflected within our communities, right? And how we can be all on board. We will put, Black Lives Matter and all this business externally facing, right? But now somebody, one of our own, friends, our own community says, hey, I want to be included differently. I want to have a conversation. And then we will have, the nature of our conversations will be things that basically equate to, you don't really need what you want or what you say you want. You don't really want it to be worded that way. Surely you don't want to have just your inclusion. Surely we want to talk about everyone's inclusion. The various degrees of like minimizing this request to say, hey, we really need it to be understood that it's not just about this wishy-washy notion of inclusion. It's about dismantling this thing. It is an issue of our times that we want to look at these things.
I just had this image of me being told that, someone I care about dearly doesn't feel welcome in my space. And what I do is write a letter to, my representative about it.
Sure. Yeah.
That's kind of way it feels sometimes, I think, for people.
Well, and it is very much a direct, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we want to write letters outside to say, somebody else do something about this issue. And then, people in our own midst, right? And that is the eighth principle. It's people of color and allies have come forward and said, hey, we want this to be addressed. And all of a sudden, no, for some of us.
And one of the, it's not news, but one of those words is accountability. And I think, some people are having a hard time with this word because it really makes us look inward and see if I think people are really scared at not being perfect at it right away. And so let's not even put some sort of standard to how we want to be in good relationship with each other, with the people who are crying for us to step up, you know, and that
Yeah.
perfectionism is one of those white supremacist, one of the top characteristics of white supremacy culture.
Yeah, we
Colonized
definitely,
culture, you can exchange the two. If you don't want to use the word white supremacy, you can use the word colonizer.
Yep.
Yeah.
Colonizer culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and we see this coming up in conversations about the principles where people want to say, hey, but what about democracy? And I think it's an interesting sort of thing where sometimes this idea of being able to speak and say everything that we want, right? That freedom is then when we mention the word accountable, some people are looking at that saying, hey, but I want the freedom to say anything and everything I want, regardless of who's in my midst, regardless of who it hurts, regardless of, you know, if I place attention on this, then what else isn't getting attention? I'm going to dominate this space by talking about this thing or this, whatever it is in this way, in order to make my needs or my desires the focal point of whatever it is we're doing, right? And when we talk about accountability, it could be a tool to harm one another with, you know, where then we start to say, well, now you're being a horrible excuse for a Unitarian. You're not doing your part on many levels. I'm disappointed in you, right? Which is a shaming thing. But when we hold ourselves accountable, which is what we're talking about in the responsibility covenant, right? It's not something imposed on us by an outside force that then we get to be measured against and told we either succeed, you know, check the box, or we don't. But it's more something that we say, you know what? I'm going to keep track of what's going on in me. I'm going to notice that and what resistance comes up. And you don't even have to worry because I've got myself in check here.
And we've had this experience where people have written to us about some of the programming in a way that was very clearly them responding through their privilege, and then coming to their own understanding. Oh my goodness, I'd said that, I did that, and us being able to witness them with love and kindness as they said, oh, even if it's not even necessarily being accountable, but understanding that could have had a really harmful consequence to people that they cared about, and that it happened in our space made it that harm part not happen, because we were there to contain that.
Yep.
And that person was able to change that behavior, or at least be faster in recognizing when that response was coming up. So I think this is something that we're hoping will be reminding people of during these forums, is the spaces for us to witness ourselves, feeling resistance, reacting through our discomfort. We're going to list out all of the ways in which we do that are founded in research and what it looks like for us as a covenanting faith to hold ourselves and each other responsible and accountable when this stuff comes up.
Yeah, when you're speaking right there, it's reminding me of, like, it's just a tool that we can choose to use, but that helps us to become more conscious.
Yeah.
So where things that were, you know, previously invisible to ourselves that we can't see become more visible. Or you know, David Camp, who spoke to many of us earlier on in the year, right, was talking about the unconscious bias that we have, that we all have. And that when we become aware of that unconscious bias, then we can start to begin to work on that in a different way. And so it's with the responsibility covenant, it's basically an invitation to say, okay, become very aware of what's going on in you. And in some cases, it will only be us that knows. So for instance, right, I could bring up a point about something. Say I want to talk about the wording of the eighth principle or something like that, right? And I could come at it from a perspective where I realize that I'm truly inquiring from a humble, vulnerable place about how if we could word this in any way that would increase our accountability and our the kind of breadth of our commitment to inclusion, right? The breadth and the depth of it. I could notice in myself, like, no, I'm actually coming from a very vulnerable place. Or I could notice that, hey, you know what? I'm doing a bit of a what do they call it, a red herring thing here, where I'm going to talk all intellectual like about this thing, and I'm going to say we could word it this way or that way or that way or this way. And I could notice in myself that doing that behavior feels like I get to be a little less vulnerable. Oh, that's more in my comfort zone. I like having those conversations. That feels a little more arm's length for me. And that is a subtle difference that you may or may not pick up on, but an interesting thing is often people looking at us can see that. They can see it. So then it's not about turning around and, somebody was witnessing me doing something. It's not like they'd turn to me and say, Erin, you horrible Unitarian. You're not living up to whatever, right? But more like saying, hey, so when you're speaking like that, what's coming up for you? What's your level of vulnerability right now? And if I'm in a teachable place, I might go, oh, I'm not even sure what my level of vulnerability is. I lost track of that piece and got so excited about saying the thing I had in my head that I wanted to say that I kind of forgot, right? Or someone might say, hey, Erin, repeat that now and imagine yourself speaking to someone opposite of you right now, right? Just right there, a person of color. Feel those words, feel the impact, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing that we're talking about with accountable, is that we're being each other's helpmates along in this journey of becoming more conscious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not supposed to be a punishment, but sometimes becoming conscious is a little bit of hard work.
Since we've been doing this responsibility covenant stuff and digging into it, I've noticed myself a few times in a different community where I have been that person, and it didn't have anything to do with vulnerable peoples. It just had to do with group dynamics. And I was really stuck on process and really stuck on language, and then realizing that these are characteristics of being colonized, and trying not to get in that shame cycle. This tool has actually helped me to go back into those spaces with a different sort of ability to be in relationship with these people. So this tool applies to many things, just so you know. Is there anything that we want to talk about specifically about the responsibility covenant here, or would we like to just acknowledge it exists and encourage everyone to read it thoroughly? What do you think we should be doing?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah. So, there has been some people who say, hey, so when we talk about keeping our discomfort in check, are we meaning then that, say, person of color or person who's experiencing exclusion in our community some way, you better just keep your discomfort in check?
Right.
Because it's your discomfort and we don't want, is that the intent? And so one thing we want people to know for sure is that this has been created with many eyes on it,
Yes.
including people of color, including Dismantling Racism group, the Widening the Circle groups. Like, there's been various people who've been looking at it, and simply no. The answer to the question is no. If we are not trying to say to somebody who's experiencing some sort of exclusion that they should be kept quiet about it. What we are trying to say is that we are recognizing, as settler people, many of us white-skinned settler people, but not exclusively, that we have created an environment that favors our own comfort.
Yes.
It privileges our comfort levels. And what we are specifically trying to do is switch that so that we can make space for other people to say, here is my reality, right? Here's how I feel when I'm in the midst of our group, right? And we want to create space for that to be heard in a way that is not harmful, where then people need to be worried that they've now said their vulnerable truth, and now they have to face the firing line of all of these, super now irritated settler folks who are not used to having, their privileges in any way subordinated to someone else, right?
Right.
So it's us as settler folks, as white-skinned folks, as people with relative power in whatever situation we're talking about. It's about that. And there may be times, so you and I have come to this earth in a human package. We share that with everyone, but also a female package.
Yes.
Right? So there may be times when we're talking about an issue and we are the ones in relative privilege.
Yes.
Because, say we're talking about, say, race, and you and I have white or lighter colored skin.
Yeah.
Right? So we're in a position of relative privilege.
Yeah.
But say we're talking about something to do with gender, we might be in a position where then we're the ones with the less relative privilege.
Right.
So that's the other point, right? Is that for the eighth principle conversations, we're looking very closely at race, right? But this tool is not meant for just that. It's meant for any conversation, and even conversations where you might look at it and say, there's no particular power differential here.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't always have to be that. You could just look at it and go, you know what? These are 5-6 people here, but we're going to have a conversation, but we want to go deeper in our conversation. We want to allow more of ourselves to be visible, to be present. And we want to deliberately create and set up signs and signals that say, this is a safe space to bring all of you. Whatever it is you want to talk about, whatever is true about your life, you can bring this here. And we want to create a culture that has some indicators that show that this is a safe space to show up as all of you.
Yes. And the responsibility covenant has lots of information and tools in it as to even how to respond to how we can respond to our own discomfort at different, like at varying levels. Some things are really a pastoral care concern. Some of it is like a deeply spiritual thing that we need to reflect off of someone that's got that expertise. Some of it is just stuff that we just notice in our skin. So, the tool is I guess what we try to do is, like you said, remove all the tripping, all the barriers to being in it. And this is going to help us in many conversations with all sorts of diverse peoples, which is really our goal as Unitarians.
Yeah. And we want to show up. We've used the term firm compassion.
Yes.
So we want to hold ourselves up collectively to take actions that actually help us to not just aspire to be something, but to bring that to life, right? So we want to be firm about that whenever we face discomfort, that we're not like just saying, oh, well, we're going to all get together, and if we have a vote, then we just get to erase this person's existence, their story, their perspective, whatever it is, because it causes us discomfort. We're being firm and saying, no, that's not what we're about, right? Okay. But then the compassion side is when we struggle, and we all will, to the degree that we're willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
I've noticed in myself lately, certain things I'm like, no problem. I can do that any day. And I start getting into that heart space where I feel more vulnerable. That's when I will start to do kind of goofy behaviors that are even like, for me, like I'm pretty decently aware. I'm like, look at that. Or I need someone to point it out to me and say, hey, so something in your eyes when you said that, it looked different than when you speak normally. What's going on there, right? And when it's that compassion that looks at me as a human being, that whenever I behave in such a way that is a little attacking or a little bit getting in my head or aloof about things or intellectualizing, it's not because I'm a horrible human or I'm trying to hurt people. It's because there's something going on in me that's deeply afraid, often afraid to be seen for what it is, or in my case, sometimes it's to be seen without knowing what I'm doing, right? I don't know what I'm supposed to think or feel or act or be like right now.
And everyone's watching.
Yeah, and I feel exposed and on the spot. That's when I will start to do behaviors that, as someone is looking compassionately on me, I've so appreciated when it's been brought to my attention in that way, where it's like, hey, so you don't, right now, some of your words are getting harsh, Erin. And what is this? What is this about? Yeah, as opposed to your words are getting a little harsh here.
Yeah.
You're a horrible, bad human.
Yeah.
Very different.
Canceled. It's like,
Yep, you're disqualified. You should be excommunicated from Unitarianism because you are now not living up to our aspirational goal of how we think we should be.
So firm compassion is a form of accountability. It's the way that we can be accountable or hold each other accountable while not holding each other in a place of shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and holding each other accountable for our highest growth,
our highest
for
self.
our expansion, not accountable in a punitive way. And one of the saddest things I have 2 children, watching and seeing, their experiences with being held accountable, and how, at some point some cases they fear it because of punitive, humiliating, evaluative measures that have been imposed upon them, right? To basically humiliate them into conforming in a certain way, right? As opposed to accountable, meaning, hey, I'm with you in this journey. I know you've said you're trying to try, whatever it is. How can we do this together, right? It's a sad thing for me when, as human beings, we think about the idea of being accountable in community as a potentially humiliating, terrifying experience.
Rejecting, there are 2 other documents that you can find in whatever package this is all being presented in. One of them is a very clear list of white supremacy culture characteristics. Please read it. You might just see yourself and then feel not alone, and then might be able to pre-process some of the guilt and shame that might come up. It's been circulating around. So I think in particular, it's just going to be really helpful for people to come already knowing why some things in the responsibility covenant look like they do. You will see some of these characteristics in yourself, in the responsibility covenant, in each other. And for me, I use it as a way to actually, when I'm moving through life generally, and I catch myself getting caught up in some of these characteristics, it's helpful for me because I can say to myself, oh, that's that colonization doing its thing.
Yeah.
So witness it, thank it, and what can I do to remove it somehow or behave differently? And this particular document has antidotes. So it's a very useful tool. I just wanted to make sure that people had an understanding that exists and it's valuable. And the other document is a New Ideas adoption curve. Yeah, the adoption curve to me is a tool to understand where I am at in terms of grasping and accepting and then acting on something that is new to me. In this case, it's dismantling racism and decolonizing. And it's also a helpful tool for me to recognize where someone else is at and if it is worth my energy to be in conversation with them or not, based on how far apart they are from me on the curve. If they're really far away from me on the curve, I think it's just agree to disagree. If they're a little bit close to me, I think then there's room to have a conversation. And if you read this document, then you'll find a lot more information. And
it's not to say that, you should wash your hands and not have certain conversations with certain people. It's not about that. It's understanding what persuades different types of people, right? So some people, it is by watching and observing and seeing something. So when, something becomes a norm within our group, and this is just the way that it is, for example, when it was started in some congregations that we do a land acknowledgement to say we are on Indigenous lands and whatever, right? There's going to be people who, just by virtue of seeing someone doing that, goes, okay, I guess that's what we do. Yeah. And then they'll go along with that after, right? After it's gained momentum and it's just a thing that we do.
Yeah,
so you could have a fit about trying to convince them ahead of time, or you could go, okay, on this particular issue, I think that there might be one or two of these quadrants. And so I'm not going to stress about that. I'm going to look and see who is in that early majority, early adopter, early majority category, and see how we then can move this through this conversation. This is what we're trying to do in these forums, is not just get the idea, but actually say, okay, so now what? This is how you use that idea, right? So think about me, back to my grandparents. Why I might, be talking to them about using some other technology besides their VHS. Here's how you use it, Grandma. Here's how it make your life easier. Here's what, it's about. Here's how it works. These are that, how we, or in this case, my children trying to convince me to update my cell phone, right? Yeah. If I had this conversation and one of my kids said, Mom, I think you're like a laggard or worse. Like yeah, so they're trying to convince me by showing me, by making it part of my reality, by letting me hold theirs. This is the sort of behaviors we can do.
I have to say that the land acknowledgement is one that I actually brought up to a congregation that I was a member of. And I was told no. And then years later, upon returning, they were using it, and it had nothing to do with, I didn't push for it. I felt hurt by it, but when it became trending and popular and the norm, then it became something that they did. And now they've done it in a way that I think is actually quite respectful to the actual situation that's going on. Because now we're learning that land acknowledgements aren't enough. So we're digging in even deeper into how to be in better relationship. So like the learning and adoption curve doesn't end just by, making one small adjustment. Yeah. But that's a lived example of how that works.
Yeah. And that's a great example. And it shows that, you're not necessarily a more evolved person because you adopted it sooner.
No,
that for that particular group, something needed to come into to click, needed to see a role model, needed to understand the meaning, needed to see evidence, whatever it was. And when that point was reached, then they move forward with.
And I think that's why our Truth Healing and Reconciliation Initiative has so much momentum, is because it started grassroots and it has slowly developed. And at times quickly developed, so maybe too quickly sometimes, by people who are ready and willing to engage, and sometimes because they've learned information that they just can't deny at this point. And so good thing that we're prepared to do deep dives into this stuff, because there was a lot of early innovation happening. So as another example.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. So there were Unitarians that came forward and said, we need to do this, and paved that way.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes a really important thing when we talk about not getting upset with each other, right? Continue to do all the things that we do. If you happen to notice on this issue that you're somewhere in the early half of the curve, continue to talk, continue to share, continue to show the benefits, continue to explain, answer questions, all the different things as many times as you need to do it, knowing that at some point they'll become that critical mass, and then the movement will change. And why we mention it in this particular situation is that notice in yourself, where are you, not just for this, but for anything, where are you on the curve? And it doesn't make anybody, necessarily right or wrong, But it is an important thing to realize that there's always going to be this phase of adopting this new idea. And we can get ourselves really discouraged and really worked up when we encounter people who do not seem to be getting it at the pace that we think they should get it. You know, to be honest, there's been also, you know, quite a lot of, well, let's just talk about it outright, grief.
Yeah.
There's been grief. And then, as we know, some of us know, the cycles of grief, right, include anger, denial, and bargaining, and depression, and all these different, you know, coming to terms with the fact that collectively, we are not as we imagined ourselves to be.
Yeah.
You know, that when we are faced with an issue of our time, and Unitarianism has always been a flexible tool to be responsive to the environment around us, and some people in their congregations are feeling like the resistance of others means that together we are not what we thought we were.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is, you know, sort of a process that goes on with that, because there can be a rejection then happening where we say, hey, I've imagined myself, or I am at this further, more evolved state of Unitarianism, right? And now you, person who's standing in resistance to this thing that I feel is so obvious and so necessary, I'm angry with you.
Yeah.
You know, in some cases, we've heard people use even stronger words than that, to feel like, you know, someone's got to leave here. We can't be together in this space with this difference, because I can't be who I imagined we were while you are still in my midst. You're ticking me off, person that has a different view than me, right?
Yeah.
And seeing them go through this grief cycle has been very real.
Yeah, absolutely. These forums, there's going to be 4 of them, and that they are they're designed to help us process, just process the process of being called in to dismantle racism.